In a world marked by simmering tensions and geopolitical complexities, 7 nations stand out for their strained relations with the United States. From North Korea's nuclear ambitions to Afghanistan's turbulent history, each country harbors a tale of conflict and controversy. These narratives unfold over decades, shaped by wars, insurgencies, and global power struggles. If you are American, join us as we navigate through these intricate landscapes, shedding light on why they remain among the most challenging destinations for Americans abroad. But before we start, let's aim for 500 likes on this video. Stay tuned and stay informed. Subscribe for more insightful updates. Number 7, North Korea. North Korea, officially known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is one of the most isolated and secretive countries in the world. Relations between the United States and North Korea have been fraught with tension and hostility for decades, primarily due to North Korea's nuclear ambitions and human rights abuses. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 marked the beginning of the adversarial relationship between the two nations. The war ended with an armistice, not a peace treaty, leaving North Korea and South Korea technically still at war. The U.S. has maintained a military presence in South Korea ever since, further straining relations. North Korea's development of nuclear weapons has been a significant point of contention. The country conducted its first nuclear test in 2006 and has since carried out several more, despite international condemnation and sanctions. The U.S. has led efforts to impose stringent sanctions on North Korea through the United Nations, aiming to curb its nuclear program. Diplomatic interactions between the U.S. and North Korea have been sporadic and largely unproductive. High-profile summits between former U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in 2018 and 2019 raised hopes for denuclearization but ultimately yielded little progress. The lack of a formal diplomatic relationship means that Americans traveling to North Korea do so at significant risk. North Korea is notorious for its severe human rights abuses, including forced labor camps, public executions, and extreme restrictions on freedom of speech and movement. These issues contribute to the U.S. State Department's travel advisories, which strongly discourage or outright ban travel to North Korea for American citizens. As of now, North Korea remains highly antagonistic toward the U.S. The regime's propaganda frequently depicts the U.S. as an imperialist aggressor, and any perceived softening of the U.S. stance is often met with suspicion and hostility. For Americans, traveling to or engaging with North Korea poses significant legal and personal risks, making it one of the least friendly countries for U.S. citizens. Number 6, Iran. Iran, officially known as the Islamic Republic of Iran, has had a contentious relationship with the United States since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which ousted the pro-American Shah and established a theocratic regime led by Ayatollah Khomeini. This event marked the beginning of strained relations that persist to this day. The U.S. and Iran were once close allies, but the revolution dramatically changed this dynamic. The 1979 hostage crisis, where 52 American diplomats and citizens were held hostage for 444 days in Tehran, cemented animosity between the two nations. This event remains a significant source of distrust and resentment. Iran's nuclear ambitions have been a major flashpoint. The U.S. and its allies fear Iran's nuclear program could lead to the development of nuclear weapons, despite Iran's claims that its program is for peaceful purposes. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, signed in 2015, aimed to limit Iran's nuclear capabilities in exchange for sanctions relief. However, in 2018, the U.S. withdrew from the agreement under President Donald Trump, reinstating severe sanctions and escalating tensions. U.S. sanctions have significantly impacted Iran's economy, targeting sectors like oil, banking, and trade. These sanctions aim to pressure Iran into curbing its nuclear program and addressing issues such as human rights abuses and support for militant groups. The Iranian government views these sanctions as unjust and oppressive, further straining relations. Iran's support for groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and various militias in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen has been another source of conflict. The U.S. considers these groups terrorist organizations, while Iran sees them as essential to its regional influence and security strategy. The Iranian government's record on human rights, including restrictions on freedom of speech, assembly, and the press, as well as the treatment of women and minorities, has drawn condemnation from the U.S. and international bodies. These issues contribute to the negative perception and strained relationship. Diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Iran are virtually non-existent, and the countries often find themselves on opposing sides of regional and global issues. For Americans, traveling to Iran is highly discouraged due to risks of arbitrary detention and harassment. Overall, Iran remains one of the least friendly countries for U.S. citizens, marked by deep-seated distrust and frequent geopolitical clashes. Number 5. Syria, officially known as the Syrian Arab Republic, has been a focal point of U.S. foreign policy due to its ongoing civil war, alleged use of chemical weapons, and association with terrorist groups. The relationship between the United States and Syria has been strained for decades, intensifying significantly after the Syrian civil war began in 2011. The Syrian civil war started as a series of peaceful protests during the Arab Spring, demanding democratic reforms and the resignation of President Bashar al-Assad. The regime's violent crackdown on protesters led to a full-scale civil war. The U.S. has supported various opposition groups, providing military aid and calling for Assad's removal, further straining relations. One of the most contentious issues has been the Assad regime's alleged use of chemical weapons against civilians. The U.S. has launched military strikes in response to these attacks, asserting that such actions violate international law. These strikes have heightened tensions between the two nations and drawn international condemnation. Syria has been a battleground for the ISIS, an organization that gained significant territory during the war. The U.S.-led coalition has conducted extensive military operations in Syria to combat ISIS. While these efforts have degraded ISIS's capabilities, they have also complicated the U.S.'s relationship with the Assad regime, which sees foreign intervention as an infringement on its sovereignty. Russia's support for the Assad regime adds another layer of complexity. As a key ally of Syria, Russia has provided military and political backing to Assad, often putting it at odds with U.S. interests in the region. This proxy dynamic has exacerbated the already volatile U.S.-Syria relationship. The Syrian civil war has resulted in a severe humanitarian crisis with millions of refugees and internally displaced persons. The U.S. has provided substantial humanitarian aid, but the Assad regime's hindrance of aid delivery has drawn criticism from the international community. Diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Syria are virtually non-existent. The U.S. maintains strict sanctions against the Assad regime and has no embassy in Damascus. Travel to Syria for American citizens is highly discouraged due to the ongoing conflict, risk of kidnapping, and general instability. Given these factors, Syria remains one of the least friendly countries for Americans, marked by deep-seated animosity and geopolitical conflict. Number 4. Venezuela, officially the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, has seen increasingly hostile relations with the United States, particularly since the early 2000s. These tensions are rooted in ideological differences, economic sanctions, and political turmoil within Venezuela. Relations between the U.S. and Venezuela began to deteriorate significantly during the presidency of Hugo Chavez, 1999 to 2013. Chávez's socialist policies, anti-American rhetoric, and close alliances with countries like Cuba and Russia clashed with U.S. interests. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, has continued this antagonistic stance. The U.S. has imposed a series of economic sanctions on Venezuela, targeting individuals, government entities, and the oil sector, which is the backbone of the Venezuelan economy. These sanctions aim to pressure the Maduro government to restore democratic processes and address human rights abuses. However, the Venezuelan government claims these sanctions are responsible for the country's economic woes, further fueling anti-American sentiment. Venezuela has been embroiled in a political crisis since 2019, when opposition leader Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president, challenging Maduro's legitimacy. The U.S. and several other countries recognized Guaidó as the legitimate leader of Venezuela, while Maduro retained the support of key allies, including Russia and China. This international division has deepened the rift between Venezuela and the U.S. The U.S. has frequently condemned the Maduro government for human rights violations, including the repression of political opponents, suppression of free speech, and crackdowns on protests. These issues have been a significant factor in the imposition of sanctions and international isolation. Venezuela is facing a severe economic and humanitarian crisis characterized by hyperinflation, widespread poverty, and shortages of basic necessities. The U.S. has provided humanitarian aid to the Venezuelan people, but the Maduro government has often blocked or politicized aid deliveries, exacerbating tensions. Diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Venezuela are virtually non-existent, with the U.S. Embassy in Caracas closed since 2019. Travel to Venezuela is highly discouraged for American citizens due to crime, civil unrest, and the arbitrary detention of U.S. nationals. The Maduro government frequently uses anti-American rhetoric to bolster its domestic support, making Venezuela one of the least friendly countries for Americans. Number 3. Yemen. Yemen, officially known as the Republic of Yemen, has been embroiled in a brutal civil war since 2015, creating one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. The United States' involvement in the conflict and its stance on various factions have made Yemen a hostile environment for Americans. The Yemeni civil war began when Houthi rebels, a Shia-led group backed by Iran, seized control of the capital, Sana'a, and forced the internationally recognized government of President Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi to flee. This conflict has drawn in regional powers, with Saudi Arabia leading a coalition including the United Arab Emirates to support Hadi's government. The U.S. has provided logistical and intelligence support to the Saudi-led coalition, further entrenching its involvement in the conflict. Yemen is a significant battleground for terrorist groups, including al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the ISIS. The U.S. has conducted numerous drone strikes and special operations targeting these groups. While these actions aim to reduce terrorism, they have also resulted in civilian casualties and anti-American sentiment among the Yemeni population. The war has devastated Yemen, leading to widespread famine, disease outbreaks, and the collapse of basic services. The U.S. has provided substantial humanitarian aid, but the conflict has hindered aid delivery. The humanitarian crisis has exacerbated hostility toward foreign involvement, including that of the U.S. The U.S. Embassy in Yemen suspended operations in 2015 due to the escalating conflict, leaving Americans with no consular support in the country. Diplomatic relations are minimal, and the volatile security situation makes Yemen extremely dangerous for U.S. citizens. Yemen is a focal point in the broader proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The U.S. support for the Saudi-led coalition aligns it against the Iranian-backed Houthis. This alignment has made the U.S. a target of hostility from groups sympathetic to the Houthis and other factions opposing Saudi influence. Yemen remains highly unstable and dangerous, with ongoing conflict, terrorism, and a dire humanitarian situation. For Americans, the risk of kidnapping, violence, and arbitrary detention is significant. The U.S. State Department strongly advises against travel to Yemen, and the lack of a functioning embassy further underscores the peril for U.S. citizens. Consequently, Yemen is one of the least friendly countries for Americans, characterized by deep-seated conflict and regional power struggles. Number 2, Somalia, officially the Federal Republic of Somalia, has been plagued by instability, conflict, and lawlessness for decades, making it one of the most dangerous countries for Americans. Somalia has experienced civil war since the early 1990s, following the collapse of the Siad Barre regime. The ensuing power vacuum led to intense clan-based fighting, warlordism, and the rise of militant groups. The U.S. military intervention in the early 1990s, particularly the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993, resulted in significant casualties and a retreat from direct involvement, leaving a lasting impact on U.S.-Somalia relations. Somalia is home to the militant Islamist group Al-Shabaab, which emerged as the radical youth wing of the Islamic Courts Union. Al-Shabaab has carried out numerous attacks within Somalia and neighboring countries, posing a significant security threat. The U.S. has conducted airstrikes and special operations targeting Al-Shabaab leaders and infrastructure, contributing to anti-American sentiment. Somalia's coastal waters became infamous for piracy in the early 2000s, with Somali pirates hijacking commercial vessels and demanding ransoms. Although international naval efforts have reduced piracy incidents, the threat still persists. These piracy activities further complicate the security landscape for Americans in the region. Somalia faces a severe humanitarian crisis with widespread poverty, famine, and displacement. The lack of a stable government and ongoing conflict hinder the delivery of aid. The U.S. provides humanitarian assistance, but access remains challenging, and aid workers often operate in dangerous conditions. The U.S. maintains diplomatic relations with Somalia, but the security situation severely limits engagement. The U.S. Embassy in Somalia was reopened in 2019 after being closed since 1991, yet its operations are constrained by security concerns. Travel advisories strongly warn against travel to Somalia due to the high risk of kidnapping, terrorism, and violent crime. Somalia remains highly volatile, with ongoing conflict, terrorist activities, and severe humanitarian needs. For Americans, the risks of violence, kidnapping, and lack of consular support are significant. Number 1, Afghanistan, officially the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, has been a focal point of U.S. foreign policy since the 9/11s, leading to military intervention, nation-building efforts, and ongoing conflict. The U.S. military intervention in Afghanistan began in 2001, following the September 11th attacks orchestrated by al-Qaeda, which operated from Afghanistan under Taliban protection. The U.S. aimed to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime, which harbored the terrorist group. The U.S.-led coalition toppled the Taliban government swiftly, but the subsequent insurgency and nation-building efforts have prolonged U.S. military engagement. The conflict has resulted in significant casualties, both military and civilian, and has cost trillions of dollars. Despite efforts to establish a stable Afghan government and security forces, the Taliban insurgency persisted, regaining significant control in rural areas and launching attacks on Afghan and coalition forces. The U.S. has conducted airstrikes and special operations against Taliban leaders and fighters, contributing to ongoing violence. Afghanistan faces profound humanitarian challenges, including poverty, food insecurity, and a lack of access to education and health care, exacerbated by decades of conflict. The U.S. has provided humanitarian aid, but security concerns often hinder effective aid delivery. The U.S. has engaged in diplomatic efforts to negotiate a political settlement with the Taliban and support Afghan-led peace processes. These efforts culminated in the U.S.-Taliban agreement in 2020, aiming for a phased withdrawal of U.S. troops and intra-Afghan negotiations for a political settlement. As U.S. and NATO forces withdraw, Afghanistan faces an uncertain future. The Taliban has made territorial gains, raising concerns about the fate of Afghan civilians, particularly women and minorities. The security situation remains volatile, with ongoing violence and humanitarian needs. The U.S. Embassy in Kabul continues to operate, albeit with reduced staff, and travel advisories warn against travel to Afghanistan due to the high risk of terrorism, kidnapping, and insurgency. Overall, Afghanistan remains one of the least friendly countries for Americans, marked by prolonged conflict and geopolitical complexities.